Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm Will Martindale, the author of Responsible Investment, and it's an insider's account of what's working, what's not, and where next about responsible investment. Now, the publisher is Palgrave Macmillan, and they got in touch with me now almost 4 years ago. And when they wrote to me, I thought, yeah, I could write a book. It'd probably take me 6 months, maybe 9 months. Well, it ended up taking more than 3 years, and I've got two small children, and they would start to get a bit frustrated with me. They'd say, look, why are you spending all of your evenings and weekends working? And I said, well, I'm not working. Don't worry. I'm writing a book, and it's going to be a bestseller, and it's going to sell millions of copies. Well, it turns out that they don't really do sarcasm, and they got in touch with their friends at school and their teacher and said, look, my dad's an author of a best-selling book that's going to sell millions of copies. And the teacher then gave me a call and said, look, I hear you're the author of a book that's going to sell millions of copies. Well, she was pretty disappointed, to say the least, when I asked if she'd heard of ESG. I didn't get a chance to present to the school, so it's a pleasure to be presenting to you instead. Now, the book is a bit different from others on responsible investment. It's not academic. It's a series, essentially, of stories. It's intended as a personal and accessible account of my time working in responsible investment. And for me, the process really started when I was attending the COP, the Conference of Parties, the big UN climate conference that took place in Glasgow, hosted by the UK government. I was pretty excited about this event because we'd been through a series of lockdowns, and it was the first time in a while that I was going to be able to meet some of those working in the industry in person and hear about what they're working on and learn about best practice. At least that's what I thought it would be. Now, Glasgow is a beautiful city. I've been there as a tourist many times, but unfortunately, it's not really a city that's set up to host a make or break climate conference. For one, there's just not enough hotels. So I ended up staying in Edinburgh. Actually, most people, as far as I could work out, ended up staying in Edinburgh. And many of them, believe it or not, were being chauffeur driven in cars to this climate conference. I took the train. And then when you got to Glasgow, I found myself in these sort of three separate bubbles. You had private sector, including investors. You had governments and policymakers. And you had NGOs, three separate communities in literal tents in their own marquee, not really talking to each other, not really working on solutions, an approach that hasn't worked and, in my view, won't work. But that wasn't the most egregious thing. The most egregious thing for me was a pay-to-play conference that took place alongside COP. Now, as you may well know, COP is timetabled into different days. So you have a day on different topics. And one of those days is on finance. And alongside that was an investment event. And as I said, I was excited about this, thought that we'd be hearing about best practice, would be problem solving, would be really challenging. Well, it turned out that it was a pay-to-play conference. It wasn't the quality of the ideas that you had or the conviction on sustainability. I mean, sure, there was a component of that, but ultimately, actually, it was about whether or not your employer was prepared to pay for you to have a panel or a speaking slot. Now, as you think, well, that was a few years ago, and since then we've had this sort of anti-greenwashing regulation, and we've had a lot of improvements around responsible investment. Well, earlier this year, if you were so inclined, you could have attended the Verbier Summit. Now, I happen to really enjoy skiing. I'm sure many of you do too. And if you're well enough to go skiing and well enough to stay in Verbier and indeed at the W Hotel, then that's great and good for you. But for me, the idea of hosting a biodiversity and SDG event at one of the most exclusive, unecologically friendly ski resorts at one of the most exclusive hotels in the world, well, I think responsible investment has lost its way. And that was really the genesis for me in writing this book, that for all the noise, responsible investment remains unproven. That's if you define responsible investment as contributing to real world sustainability impact. And that despite everything that we're doing, someone somewhere is paying for this. And that's often the hairdresser or the car mechanic or the Uber driver saving for her or his retirement. that responsible investment has too often become the unthinking, often arbitrary integration of black box opaque ESG scores into investment decision making. And that's why I've put forward a modern definition of responsible investment in this book, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But before we think about that definition, let's just think about responsible investment's theory of change. Now, in the diagram that I've got in front of you, we as savers invest in different ways. We may have a pension fund or an insurance fund, or we invest through mutual funds. And the sort of collective vehicles through which we invest are called asset owners. Now, asset owners may invest themselves, but often they invest via an intermediary, an asset manager. And that asset manager may have specialisms in different types of asset class, listed equity, fixed income, and so forth. The companies, the brands that we're all familiar with, Coca-Cola, Amazon, so on. Now, responsible investment, at least in my view, is trying to do two things. It's trying to create an investment return, and it's also trying to achieve some sort of real-world sustainability objective. And it tries to do that essentially through two mechanisms, through capital allocation and through stewardship. And within stewardship, I would argue that would include policy engagement too. Now, let's think about that modern definition. Well, I think a modern definition of responsible investment is one in which the investor intentionally seeks to maximize positive real-world sustainability impact and minimize negative real-world sustainability impact. And the investor does that through capital allocations, through stewardship, and through policy engagement. Now, I argue in the book that there are 5 characteristics of responsible investment. A clear real-world goal. For example, I want to tackle gender inequality, or I want to improve the biodiversity characteristics of land where the companies in which I invest operate, or I want to try and contribute to the extraction of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It has an intention. How do I intend to meet that goal? It has a series of processes. What are the processes that I would go through in order to meet the intention, in order to achieve the goal? We need to measure that, and not measure it just for ourselves or for our clients and savers, but also for our regulators. So our regulators understand exactly the contribution that the investment community is making towards sustainability goals. And finally, I argue that responsible investment should be consistent with risk-return objectives, because if you argue in favor of concessionary investing, then the question immediately becomes how much concession, on which issues, and who decides. I think it's a governance framework that just doesn't work. Now, the book does try and put forward a series of solutions, and those solutions I've categorized under what I'm calling systems thinking or systems change. I argue that investors should act as a universal owner, because in this sense, they're owning the universe. They're owning the full universe of companies. The types of pension products into which we might invest may be invested in hundreds and potentially even thousands of companies. The performance of those pension products is inherently linked to the performance of the economy as a whole. I argue in favor of systemic stewardship, and I've got a slide on that in a moment, particularly around stewardship resourcing. I believe we need to democratize the savings industry. Often the people that are making decisions on our behalf, we have no influence over who those people are. I argue in favor of maximizing the use of influence. Now, I'm a maths grad. I'm sure many of the people working in the investment and finance sectors are also maths grads too. And yet, when it comes to the types of action and activity that we undertake in order to achieve a sustainability objective, it's very unscientific. It's like, oh, we'll try this or we'll try that. There's not a degree of the being methodical about the types of actions that we can take in measuring their influence. And finally, I argue in favor of more political engagement, being prepared to take on politics. We're in a year of mass elections, and nowhere is the politics of climate change more acute than in the US right now, being prepared to take that on. Now, I said I'd focus on just one of those, and so I want to tackle stewardship, resourcing and systemic stewardship. And to help me, I want you to think about your own pension savings. It's likely that if you've ever had a job, then you've got some sort of pension. In the UK, it's an obligation that if you start work, then subject to a salary threshold, then your employer must offer you a pension. Now, I looked at how much I was paying for my pension, and it was around 50 basis points. And then I looked at where those basis points go. What am I paying for? What's my fee paying for? Well, around 20 of those 50 basis points goes on things that you can't really do much about. The buildings costs, the personnel, the statements you get through the post, the website, and so forth. That's pretty fixed regardless of the pension provider. Around 5 of those basis points then goes on hedging costs, hedging inflation and interest rate risks. And you want that, and that's not going to change either. But that left, in my case at least, 25 basis points invested that went towards growing my investments. Then I looked at where those 25 basis points were being spent. Well, around 20 basis points was on stock selection, the individual companies in which I was invested. Only 5 basis points went on stewardship, the activity of seeking to try and change those companies. Then thinking around what the stewardship spend was being used for, well, 4 of those 5 basis points went on reporting to regulators, to clients, and marketing. Only 1 of those 5 basis points went on actual conversations with companies. And then where did that 1 basis point go? And this is deliberately too small for you to see. Well, 0.9 of those 1 basis points went on just disclosure, getting companies to disclose stuff. Only 0.1 of those 1 basis points went on actually trying to get companies to change, to decarbonize their products, to change where they're based, to try and improve the biodiversity characteristics of the land that they're responsible for. So 50 basis points in fee, only 0.1 basis points on actual change. So whether you care about antimicrobial resistance or gender inequality or biodiversity or climate change, we're fighting for scraps. We're fighting for that 0.1 of that basis point. And that's why I think responsible investment needs to change. Now, finally, hopefully you can tell through the course of this presentation that I care about these issues. I'm sure if you're attending this event, then you do too. So we have intrinsic motivations, a set of beliefs, and we care about some of the issues that we work on. But we're working through extrinsic structures. Our investments don't care. They don't have that certain set of values. Now, I don't think that we're going to be able to necessarily change that. And you've heard my arguments around concessionary investing. But I do think that we can maximize the types of efforts that we're undertaking through those extrinsic structures, that we can really put our intrinsic motivations to use through those extrinsic structures. And that is the core argument of the book. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my presentation.